Hello there, it's Phumlani. Majozi. I'm back. This is the Phumlani Majozi show, where we give you a Black conservative perspective on local and global socio-economic affairs. Remember to get a copy of my book that was published last year in November. It's available in all bookstores across South Africa. Get your copy. It's titled Lessons from Past Heroes. And in this book, I delve into the history, the politics, and the economics of South Africa. And I'm saying to the people, we can get things done if we make the right decisions on policy, on family, on politics, holding our leaders to account. That is the message of the book. Today, I'm joined by the mighty Kevin Lings. He's a chief economist at Stanlib, very much popular in the media, very much, cited in the media. His opinion, people run after it to get insights on the state of South Africa. Kevin, great to talk to you, sir. How are you doing? All good?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invite, Phumlani. It's very good to see you again. Very good to chat. I just wish that we had a lot better economic news. I was looking at a presentation recently I did back in 2005. Almost every chart was a positive chart on South Africa. It was a very uplifting presentation. The conclusions were very positive. Wow. So unfortunately, at the moment, we're scratching to fill up a presentation with any positive news. So it's definitely, the South African economic conditions have changed over that time.
Over the time. And I'm sure you were young as well at the time. Yourself.
I was a lot younger, yes.
You were a lot younger, yes. Kevin, you and I told you about this before this week, that I last interviewed you when I was a radio talk show host back in July 2018. Right. This was the first year of Ramaphosa after his party, the ANC, had ousted Jacob Zuma early that year, and then he took over and he was going to campaign and run, of course, to be officially elected the president of South Africa in 2019. So you and I were talking at a period where it was between the time he had taken over from Zuma and the time where he would be officially, be voted for into power. And, when we spoke, Kevin, because I listened to our interview this morning just to reflect on the conversation we had. And amongst the things that you said was that he was inheriting a mess. No doubt it was exactly that. There had been a lot of mismanagement of SOEs, corruption under Jacob Zuma. The situation was not good. Unemployment rates had risen under Jacob Zuma. So the macroeconomic metrics were not looking good. But then at the time you said that, you thought Ramaphosa, and you're not alone, that he had the credibility, the capacity to tackle the economy and put it in the right direction. I guess in short, Kevin, as we start, given those sentiments and those views that you expressed at the time, where are we right now under Ramaphosa? Have things gotten better or worse? In your opinion, where are we for the general public? Please explain to us in simple terms.
Sure, no problem. So, I think those were reasonable views back in 2018. I think most people were anticipating that the president would be able to turn South Africa around. The speeches he was making at the time certainly were saying the right things. The focus areas he was highlighting were exactly the right areas. The types of things he wanted to introduce certainly seemed appropriate. And so I think there was a legitimate expectation that he would start to make a real difference, and that by this time, if we had thought about 2024, we would have assumed that the economy would have been in significantly better shape than it is at the moment. We would have anticipated much higher growth rate, much higher levels of fixed investment, much better employment, and a reduction in the unemployment rate, So it's been disappointing. Now, has it got worse? In some areas, yes, but has it got worse across all of the different components? No, that would be unfair. That would be very critical, and I don't think that's justified. I think in some areas there has been some gain, some improvements, but you would say that in total, this economy has not been able to show the type of revival that was expected. And in critical areas, the deterioration is very evident. Government debt is looking a lot worse, 75% of GDP. That has definitely got worse. Government's
And
debt
by the way,
servicing
Kevin,
costs.
before you continue, you've just spoken about debt. How are we doing in contrast to other emerging markets? Those levels of debt. Are we doing badly or sort of in the same level?
So no, we are pretty much in line with the general trend. The trend around the world has been significantly higher government debt. In developed economies, most of those countries have debt well in excess of 100% of GDP. In emerging markets, it varies a bit, but yes, 75% would be considered on the high side. But we wouldn't be alone. We wouldn't be a big outlier. Where we are different, where it's hurting us, is the interest cost of the debt. So the problem is not the total debt necessarily, the 75%. As I say, many countries have more than that and have much better credit ratings, even with that level of debt. The problem for South Africa is how much is that debt costing us? What is the interest cost of the debt? And that's 20% of tax revenue. And
Yes,
that
I
amounts
heard
to
that during the finance minister said that during his budget presentation. Very disturbing.
So that amounts to 1 billion rand a day, every day, Saturdays and Sundays included, right? So at the moment, the government is spending, it collects all of this money, and before it does anything, it has to spend 1 billion rand every day just on paying interest, not paying back the debt, just paying the interest. And that's the problem. When you're trying to do all kinds of good things in the country, you are taking away 20% of your tax revenue, and you're not able to spend that on any social programs, on any infrastructure. It simply goes to pay the debt. And so the debt level is unsustainable at these levels. You can't continue on. You can't continue to become more and more indebted, because eventually the interest cost will overwhelm the budget. You will have to start to make very substantial changes to how many people you employ, how many social payments you make, because the interest cost will be way too big. So that's got to be controlled, and we can talk about what's been done to control that, but that's a very clear area of deterioration over Cyril's term, and certainly not what was expected. The growth rate last year, 0.6%. We were expecting the growth rate to pick up to over 2%, get closer to 3%. That's disappointment. The unemployment rate at over 30%, been persistently over 30%. No real gain there. That's been disappointing. So the types of inroads we were expecting him to make, he hasn't been able to achieve. Now, there are reasons why. Part of them had to do with COVID. That is a legitimate disruptor to his first term. And all countries around the world went through a very difficult phase with COVID. Economies went down dramatically. Governments became more indebted as a consequence. Economies took time to recover. And so that undoubtedly diminished the type of success he was able to achieve in his first term. But outside of that, there simply wasn't enough implementation of decent policies. I don't believe that the policy framework was problematic. I don't believe that. I think many of the policy components were good and had substance to them. What I think was a problem was that for whatever reason, his cabinet, his senior staff, he himself was not able to implement this policy in a manner that made a difference in a fairly small number of years. So let me put it this way. He took over South Africa at a point of crisis. South Africa was in a crisis. The credit rating had been coming down, the level of debt had been going up, the economy was struggling, confidence was weak, the level of corruption was starting to be understood. There were many elements that represented a point of crisis. And what you needed at that point was a president who came in and acted with urgency. Because you're now in crisis, you need to respond with a degree of urgency. And what's been missing is the degree of urgency. And initially, the narrative, which I think was reasonable at the time, the narrative said, no, the president is simply evaluating the situation. He's trying to understand what's going on. He's trying to make sure that everybody's on side. He's playing the long game. He needs to make sure that all the key participants are on board, and then he will start to implement changes. And the years went by and those changes were not implemented. And so the deterioration was effectively allowed to continue. And that deterioration was most evident in the state-owned enterprises. And so the destruction of our state-owned enterprises, which governs the key business infrastructure, the roads, the railways, the harbors, the airports, the electricity, all of that is under the control of state-owned enterprises by and large. And so the fact that we weren't able to get on top of the state-owned enterprises to reform them, that deterioration continued, and then we ended up in a much bigger crisis, which forced the government to change tactic, to change policy, and to start to implement this policy which we now follow in of private-public partnerships. But unfortunately, it feels like we had to get to that point of crisis, that point where the electricity outages became extreme, where it was clear that that was doing a huge amount of damage to the South African economy and couldn't be sustained. At that point, there was then more action from government. And that action, if you go back and look at it, was to say, okay, let's partner with the private sector, let's deregulate industry, let's allow the private sector into the energy sector. And the private sector responded. And by that response, we're starting to put the energy sector in better shape. So, and that's become now more of the mainstream policy approach. So if you look at Transnet nowadays with its network statement that was released recently, the network statement is effectively Transnet saying, we're open for business. We're open to do partnerships with private sector to run part of the rail network, not to own the rail network, but to get involved in operating the rail network. If we look at Pier 2 Harbour in Durban and contracting with the Philippines company to run Pier 2 Harbour, that's Transnet saying we want to do private-public partnerships. We want international business to run South Africa's port capacity, and we need to put our ports in better shape. And I think you're going to see similar things unfolding in other areas of infrastructure. And so you've got already some of the key infrastructure areas being reformed. And so we're talking about a policy of reform. That policy of reform, which is now center stage, is the government accepting, I think, that the fiscal position has deteriorated. In other words, to put it simply, the government's run out of money. So you have to accept that you don't have the financial strength you used to. It's accepting that the state-owned enterprises, their capacity, their capability has been diminished, that their financial strength has deteriorated, and that the private sector is willing and able to get involved in partnering with government to develop the infrastructure, and that there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with setting up these partnerships for the good of everybody. and that government is not selling the assets, it's not privatizing, it's simply recognizing that the private sector has a strong balance sheet. Private sector business is in good shape. It's got cash, it's got low debt. That private sector business has good skills, and that it wants to make a difference. And that by partnering with the government, we can take this economy into a better environment. And I think slowly, that has become the focus. But unfortunately, a lot of damage was done over the time period from 2018 to 2021, 22, before we started to implement some of these reform processes. And that damage was unfortunate. It was not what was expected. People thought that the president would make a bigger difference quicker. And so it's been disappointing. And many people reflect on that disappointment. And therefore, it will be interesting to see how popular the president effectively is in the national election. Has this disappointment carved out his own support, the support for the ANC? Or is there still a belief that these reform processes can yield a much better result? It would be very unfortunate if at this point, right, at the point where you're starting to implement these key reforms, the politics now changes in a way that completely eradicates the reform, in which case we would take a major step backwards. So for me, the election is comes at a vital time, at a difficult time, because this reform is the most encouraging development in South Africa for many years. It has got foreigners interested. I had a meeting last week with a group of people from Washington in the United States, very interested in the reform process, asking a lot of questions about private sector involvement. It's got local business interested. I met with the CEO of a company called Traction, which is the biggest private sector operator on the African continent in the railway industry. He said to me that he thinks South Africa is going to experience a railway boom over the coming years. I haven't heard that type of language for a long time, all because Transnet is deregulating and allowing the private sector in. If you now take away that reform process because of a change in politics, that would halt the most positive development we've experienced for many years.
Now let's talk about I understand the partnership that you have touched on between the government and the private sector, because the government has been struggling and it's indebted, it's so much dysfunction as well. Therefore, the private sector now is willing to help in that. But let's talk about the private sector separately now. Over the past 5 years of Ramaphosa, how was?
Sure.
Let's talk about business markets in general. How were they? The capitalist system, the businesses, outside of government partnership, right? How was business? Was it thriving? Was it investing? What were the challenges that businesses faced during the course of Ramaphosa's first term?
Sure. So initially, you would say business confidence did pick up at the time when the president was elected. You can see that in the data. There was an expectation that things would get better. And so business was starting to discuss what that would mean in terms of fixed investment, expansion, projects, etc. But quite quickly after that, there emerged a degree of hesitancy by the business sector because it immediately didn't see that policy was starting to be implemented, and it started to adopt a wait-and-see approach. And unfortunately, that wait-and-see approach has continued on and continues on up until very recently. And that wait-and-see approach resulted in companies focusing on cost base, on focusing on how many people they employ, focusing on dealing with COVID and the aftermath of COVID and trying to recover from COVID. It focused on trying to ensure that its business was able to survive, but it didn't want to invest in new equipment, new technology. It didn't want to take additional risk. And so it turned inward, and it adopted a very conservative approach to doing business. Now, there are pluses and minuses. The big plus for South Africa is that very few businesses in South Africa have gone out of business, even though the economy has been desperately weak, even though interest rates are high now. We went through COVID. Business failures haven't been significant. And as a consequence, formal sector employment has been retained. And we see that in the tax revenue numbers. So if you look at tax revenue, it's generally exceeded expectations, partly to do with mining revenue, but also to do with the resilience in the formal sector employment. So companies in South Africa are very conservatively managed. They have very strong balance sheets. They have lots of cash on hand. They have very low debt, which means they survive. They don't grow, but they survive. And that survival is important.
But you're saying that they have held back in terms of going strongly, pushing harder in investing, right? Yes. They held back. So I asked you this question, Kevin, because here's an article I'm looking at here on my iPad from the Mail and Guardian. This is last December, right? And the title, the article was written by Sarah Smith, and the title of the article is "Why Business Fell Out of Love with Ramaphosa." This is last year. And then the opening line is, the business community initially welcomed him, but the past 5 years have disappointed, and the private sector has only recently been given a turn at the economy's steering wheel. So that's the opening line of that article. And I saw another chart the other day that showed the private sector investment, which it sort of aligns to what you are saying, that it seemed in the chart that the private sector investment was sort of in the upward trend, especially during the times of Mbeki and so on. I'm not sure how correct that data is. But then in recent years, there was sort of that stagnation, or it was getting flatter, no longer an upward, positive slope. So, and I ask this question because I've always felt like, we need a stronger private sector really to thrive in our market. Is my assessment correct?
Yes, 100%. So private sector investment did well during Mbeki years, and certainly the Soccer World Cup helped that a lot. But then shortly after Zuma took over, confidence started to decline and private sector investment declined. And in truth, it's never really recovered from that decline. Even though Cyril took over and there was initially some optimism, that optimism wasn't accompanied by an increase in fixed investment. It was accompanied by an increase in confidence, but that confidence never translated into fixed investment because companies, while they were more hopeful, they adopted a wait and see. They wanted to see policy being implemented, changes being made, and then they would invest, and the changes never got implemented. And so the fixed investment dwindled further. And obviously then you got to the extreme electricity outages, and you had some social protests in South Africa that got out of hand. And so the situation worsened in terms of that confidence level. And so the fixed investment never materialized. up until very recently. And the very recent is now the energy sector reform and private companies investing in solar energy and other infrastructure, which I think we'll see over time. So it has started to change. But for many years, in the initial years of Cyril's presidency, it dwindled. And what that did was it allowed private sector to control their debt, control their cash flow, to become very resilient, but not expansionary. And so business, as I said, they survived, they remained in business, but they didn't grow. They didn't help to boost the economy. Now, I think we get to an important discussion around, is business too conservative in South Africa in terms of what it wants before it is willing to invest? And I'm critical of South African business in this regard. I think business in South Africa looks to the north of South Africa, to Europe, to Switzerland, to the United States, to the UK. It sees some of the environment and it wants that environment replicated in South Africa. And that's never going to happen. South Africa is an emerging market, and like all emerging markets, South Africa is messy. Politics is messy, policy is messy. It is not an environment in which business can know for the next 5-10 years exactly what's going to occur. And so my view is that South African business needs to continue to adjust to how to do business effectively in an emerging market. And that requires that you're willing to take more risk than a business in Switzerland is willing to take. It's the nature of the environment. And I don't think that's changing. I think South Africa is a vibrant mix of cultures, of different levels of education, different levels of business acumen or business knowledge, skills, and you've got to find a way to work with what is available. Now, clearly, that sets us up for an important discussion around our lack of development of small business in this country.
I was about to touch on that because we have 5 minutes left now. I was about to ask you, Kevin, you've been speaking about, when I sent your comments, we are more speaking about business, and some people tend to think that's big business with big balance sheets, corporates. How have SMEs been doing in your view over the past years? The SMEs, which I believe are very fundamental, Kevin, for our economy. Absolutely. Very much driving.
And if South Africa is going to be a success, it has to come from small business.
Yeah, and how have they been doing in your assessment?
Struggling. It's a different environment for small business. Remember, they don't have a seat at the table. If you look at NetLag is a meeting between big business, big labor, and big government. It is not a meeting with small business. And when I look at small business, what I see are a group of people who are hardworking, entrepreneurial, creative, are making their business work under the most difficult conditions, lacking in support, lacking in financial support. And the system in South Africa is not set up.
Yeah, affects them a lot, Kevin. And they don't even have, the big amounts of money to spend on security as other big corporates can afford.
So I personally think that South Africa is missing a major opportunity to take everything from informal business, semi-formal business, small business, and put a huge effort into trying to help that sector and to talk to that sector and find out what do you need? What will make a difference for you? And it's not always finance. Some of it has to do with just regulation. Some of it has to do with harassment. Some of it has to do with logistics, access to products, and putting a real effort to get that component of this economy a lot more vital than it is now. Big business, if you think about big business is about doing more with less people. Big business is about how do we become more efficient, more productive? How do we introduce new technology? It's not the sector that's going to add a huge number of jobs. It is trying every day to do more with less people. The industry that can employ, should employ, is private, small business. And I don't think we're doing anywhere near enough, given the very obvious talent that we have in these sectors. And you just have to look around the big cities, and that talent is very evident. And that willingness to do a huge amount with very little is very evident. And I think a lot more needs to be done, but not by government sitting and deciding for themselves, by government engaging with small business to listen, what is it that small business needs, and then trying to do that. And then I think we would have something that's more vital. We would have big business partnering with government to do infrastructure. That's fine. You need a big balance sheet. You need lots of capital. That's fine. You need the engineering expertise. That's fine. And then get small business a lot more vital and get them access and support that would allow them to become more optimistic and be willing to draw in new skills and new entrepreneurial capabilities.
Yes. Kevin, we have 60 seconds. So let's be very, very brief on this one and close off. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of South Africa? An optimist, or are you pessimistic?
This is the most optimistic I've been in years. The reason is that we now have a position where we're implementing real reforms that I think are starting to make a difference. I can see that private sector is interested. I can see that from government and the president's office. They believe that this is a good initiative to continue on. And I think that as that makes progress, people will lift their confidence, and you can get a positive, self-fulfilling progress. In other words, where people see growth, they're willing to invest more, and then you get more growth. The catalyst is there. We've made the start. It obviously is still fragile. It's still at risk of a change in politics, absolutely. But we've made an important start in the reform process. And I'm confident that if we can continue that reform process, South Africa would look a lot better in just a few years.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Kevin, it's great to talk to you again. Thanks for a very insightful conversation. And hopefully we will talk again very soon.
I hope so. Thanks, Phumlani. Thanks for the invite.
Pleasure, Kevin. Have a nice one.
You too.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks, Kevin. So I will. What I will do is that, of course, I will edit a bit, and then I'm going to post it.